So yesterday, at least as of the time of filming, I don't know when this video will get out, I posted the video comparing my RTX 3080 against my RTX 4090, and I came home from work and started looking through the comments. I tried to at least skim all the comments on my channel. Anyway, I got so many of basically the different versions of the same question and a few other common questions. So just like, in my math class, if I'm coming around as, groups are working on things and everybody's asking me the same question, okay, we need to do a timeout, like whole class discussion on what's going wrong here. And the question is about, I kept constantly saying that my 4090 was CPU limited, but everybody questioned how I can be CPU limited in a scene like this when the CPU is only showing like 30% utilization. How can that be a CPU limit if the CPU is so underutilized? And I'm not just making this up. I meant to do a cool finger snap and I failed. Here, there we go. I failed again. There we go. Okay, I meant to go to the comments on this video. Let me kind of slide out of the way here. And I'm not trying to publicly shame any of these comments. There's a lot of these same comments. So what I'm doing here is I'm just taking this video's comments. Let's search by CPU. And some of these comments, aren't what I'm talking about here, but we're going to see a whole bunch of them. And a bunch of them are basically asking the same kind of question. So like, I could be wrong here, but if you were CPU limited, and let me zoom in here so you guys can all see this better. If you were CPU limited in the Spider-Man game for the 4090, wouldn't your CPU have been utilized much higher? It looked like it didn't go above 40%-ish, which is not far different, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, and there's a whole bunch of comments like this one. Can someone explain to me why the CPU never reaches any high percentages, even when it's CPU bottlenecked? And there's a whole bunch of versions of this. Hello, Daniel, there's something I don't understand when you say the video card is limited by the CPU. For example, 1425, your CPU usage is between 22 to 35%. And hey, some of these people are actually getting replies here, which actually kind of does explain the issue. It has to do with how many cores are being utilized. You can be CPU limited without the cores. Now, I tried to explain this to a few people, but when I started seeing the comments just constantly, I was just like, okay, I give up here. Especially this guy kind of mean. Oh my God, this guy kept repeating CPU limited over and over. How can be something CPU limited when CPU utilization is around 30%? These games are not limited by CPU. They are limited by very poor optimizations done by the developers who are lazy or incapable of to optimize for more than 16-thread CPUs. Okay, let's actually talk about this. So at least this guy does seem to be understanding that it does have to do with how the game is programmed. But that is still a CPU limit. In other words, let's go back to this screenshot for a second. Maybe I'll even have time to edit this video and splice in more footage. Who knows? I don't know how much time I'll have. Anyway, I'm trying to make this video before my kids get home from school. Now, anyway, so again, the scene you see above me right now, we see the RTX 4090. If you look up there, the GPU utilization percentage is 87%, which is clearly not 100%. Now, in other words, the GPU is not being fully utilized. So there has to be a reason why the GPU is not being fully utilized. And that reason is because it is CPU limited. So what do I actually mean by that? My CPU has 16 physical cores, which can then do multi-threading, giving it 32 logical threads. The vast majority of games will not, at least in any significant way, utilize more than 8 cores, or actually 8 threads is really what I mean. And so if 8 of my threads are fully utilized, that is only 25% CPU utilization, okay? So my CPU will not report 100% usage. It might report 25% usage, but that could be 8 cores 100% utilized. Now you might be like, well then why don't you show all of the cores? Guys, I've tried recording videos with 32 threads showing up here. It's this giant bar and I have to make the text so small for it all to fit. It just makes a bad video. Honestly, it just makes a bad video. And also the utilization per core jumps all over the place from one core to the other. But the idea here is that if a single core is fully utilized and that stops the game engine and by the way, I should say again, a single thread, not even a single core. If a single thread of the game's processing is causing the game to not be able to produce the next frame yet, then the game is CPU limited. Even if that was just one thread out of my 32 threads my CPU is able to calculate, and so my CPU's overall usage is extremely low, and yet it is a CPU limit. So what about this guy's, out here blaming the developers for being lazy or incapable? Now, lazy I think is the wrong word here. I think incapable of optimizing for more than 16 threads is true. Incapable of optimizing for that, but that's not because they're lazy. So you have to understand that certain computing tasks, now I am not a game developer here, but this does make sense. Okay, so a CPU can, it can parallelize a certain amount of things. And this is actually what GPUs are fantastic at. GPUs are fantastic at parallel calculations because they're deciding what color every pixel on the screen is, right? Now, all of those pixels, it's not quite this simple, but you could calculate those pixels, kind of separately in some sense, right? And then put them all together at the same time to create the image. So GPUs are fantastic for tons of parallel calculations all occurring at the same time to then produce your result that you see in the frame on the screen. Now, CPUs also can parallelize stuff, and that's what having more threads and cores is good for. But the kinds of things that a CPU are doing cannot just be parallelized in an unlimited way. In a certain sense, some element of the game is being processed as, a single thread, and that thread needs to, finish calculating before other stuff can be calculated. And it's unreasonable to expect the work that's being done on that single thread to necessarily be able to be divided up evenly between the 32 threads that my CPU has. For one thing, just the type of calculations that are occurring just don't make sense to divide up that way. They just don't. But also, the vast majority of people don't have a 32-thread CPU, so it would really be a bad idea as a developer to spend all of your time trying to find some way to get your game engine to take advantage of 32 threads when the vast majority of people playing your game don't have 32 threads. That would be bad optimization for the bulk of your user base. It's a better idea to optimize your game around what a vast majority of people actually have. And so games used to be designed around a single thread of performance. And then as, dual core CPUs and quad core CPUs, and some of those would have hyper-threading and go up to 8 threads, then games did start to take advantage of more of those threads. But you can, like I said, the type of work that a CPU is calculating in a game can only be parallelized to a limited point, okay? So there's that. Now, I did get some other questions in this video, and it was about vsync, frame rate limiting, and DLSS 3. So let's talk about that now. I got so many questions about this. I don't know if I need to search. Do I need to search the YouTube comments again? Can we say it that's YouTube videos? That's not the comments. So what if we search now for vsync, or maybe we could do FrameCap. So there's a whole bunch of people saying wait, are there high-end monitors that don't support vsync? Some people are saying, taking, the advice, oh, it doesn't support. Wait, first of all, what am I'm assuming you've all watched the last video and know what I'm talking about. So let me back up for just a second here. What am I talking about with vsync in this video? DLSS 3, that's the frame generation, it doesn't support vsync, okay? It also doesn't really support frame rate limiting. Now, I did say this in the video, that you can force vsync on through the control panel or some other programs, or enforce some sort of other frame rate limit. But what I said in the video, and I guess people didn't pick up on this, is when you do that, it's not just that it disables it in the game menu. The reason it disables it in the game menu is because DLSS 3 does not interact well with vsync or frame rate limits. So my point is here, a whole bunch of people are confused about, do I mean it doesn't support FreeSync or gsync? No, that's not what I said. A lot of people are like, can't you force it through Riva Tuner's scanline sync? Or can't you force it through Riva Tuner? Can't you limit your FPS? Okay, so yeah, a lot of people seem to misunderstand what I'm saying. So it's not that DLSS 3 can't force a frame rate limit or vsync. It's that when you do, the game doesn't behave well. So I've already explained that. Okay, so maybe let's just go back here. So how does DLSS 3 frame generation work? In other words, how is this happening? How is it increasing my frame rate so much? What is it doing? So what it does is it doesn't actually have, speaking of CPU utilization, it doesn't actually have your graphics card or your, at least the normal part of your graphics card or even the CPU or the game engine itself does not actually produce any new frames. The game is not actually running any faster. What it's actually doing is it is producing a frame, it's producing another frame, or at least most of the next frame. It knows most of what the next frame is going to look like. And then it takes what that next frame is going to be, and it takes the frame it's already generated, and it kind of averages those using the AI calculation. That's where the AI is involved. A machine learning algorithm takes those two frames along with not just the two pictures. Because if you just had the two pictures, this is something that TVs already do, although they do it pretty slowly. It's motion interpolation. But TVs already do that, but there's usually a hefty input latency penalty to that because you have to get both frames and then take the time to average them, and then you show all three frames on the screen after all that calculation has already occurred. And in some sense, that is all DLSS 3 frame generation is doing. But because this is a video game and the algorithm has access to things other than just what the pictures look like, right? It has access to frame 1, it has access to the actual frame 2, and then it inserts a frame 1.5. That's an average of those two pictures, but it can make a very good guess on that average and do it very quickly, because it also has access to things like motion vectors for where the objects in frame 1 and frame 2, where it was moving to. That's also why I don't think it needs to completely calculate frame 2 before it calculates frame 1.5. But it does need to at least partially calculate frame 2 before it creates frame 1.5. So here's the thing, guys. If you frame rate limit the game, which stops it from drawing frame 2, it waits to draw frame 2 until your monitor's ready for it, then I think what's going on here, now again, I don't have the, all the details on how this algorithm actually works, but this does seem to make perfect sense. If it needs frame 2 and frame 1 to make frame 1.5, okay, which is what it's doing, then if your frame rate limiter or your vsync, which is causing the frame rate to limit, is telling your game, don't do frame 2 yet, our monitor's waiting, then we have to wait longer to get frame 2, which means we have to wait even longer to get frame 1.5, which means that you have extra input latency. So when I say DLSS 3 frame generation adds input latency, the reason is normally your game would render frame 1 and show it to you. It would render frame 2 and show it to you. But when you do DLSS frame generation, it renders frame 1 and most of frame 2 and then averages them to get frame 1.5 before it really shows you frame 1.5 and frame 2. Does that make sense? So frame 2 gets delayed to get you frame 1.5. That happens. So if you then also tell the game engine to wait to calculate frame 2 because I'm at my frame rate limit, then you're adding even more input latency. So what I'm getting at here is you can force a frame rate limit or vsync when using frame generation. But when I did, I got horrible input latency in Plague Tale Requiem. It actually seemed to function better in Spider-Man, and I'm not quite sure why, but it did. The amount of increased frame like input latency that I got in Spider-Man didn't seem as bad as it was in Plague Tale. Now, Plague Tale, actually, I even noticed that the game's vsync still let me try to turn it on. It just wouldn't actually function. And then there was actually even a bug sometimes in that game where it would accidentally kick on vsync even when I didn't tell it to, even with frame generation enabled. And when that happened, I could instantly tell because there was a horrible, horrible input delay. It was unplayably bad. So, to be clear, yes, you can force on vsync and frame rate limits, but there is a negative penalty. It does not interact well with DLSS frame generation because of how frame generation works. Now, according to, I watched the Digital Foundry video on DLSS 3 frame generation, and they mentioned this vsync issue themselves as well, and they said that they reached out to NVIDIA regarding this issue, and NVIDIA says that they're working on compatibility with vsync, so that's a work in progress, and I hope they eventually solve that problem. But, you know, their engineers on this are a lot smarter than me and know a lot more about it. But I feel like this is going to be a very hard problem to solve because, like I said, if you have to get frame 2 before you generate frame 1.5, or at least get most of frame 2 before you generate frame 1.5, then telling it to not generate frame 2 yet because you have vsync or framecaps enabled, then that means that you have a problem there, right? Now, the other question I was getting is, wait, why would you turn on vsync at all? Why would you ever do that if you have gsync or FreeSync? So let me explain that. First of all, frame generation is compatible with FreeSync and gsync. That's not an issue. It absolutely works. The thing is, FreeSync and gsync work within a certain range of refresh rates. And when you reach your monitor's maximum refresh rate, so for example, I have an LG C1 OLED TV that I'm using as my 4K monitor, and it goes to 120 hertz, and it has, I think, FreeSync Premium with gsync compatibility. Now, when I'm within the range of frame rates where my FreeSync operates, then everything's fine. It works fine with frame generation. But when you go past 120 hertz, when the game is rendering over 120, like we see in the screenshot here, 121, then I see screen tearing. There's screen tearing because gsync and FreeSync only work when you're within that monitor's window. So when you go past your monitor's frame rate, you can still get screen tearing, which is why you should still enable a frame rate limit or vsync, which operates as a frame rate limit when you combine it with gsync and FreeSync when you go past your monitor's maximum refresh rate, okay? So usually it is a good idea to do that if you want to avoid screen tearing. Now, if you're playing competitive games, you usually would not enable a frame rate limit and you would not enable vsync because in a competitive game, you just put up with the screen tearing, you just live with it because you don't want to limit the frame rates the game is generating because you want the decreased input latency by the game generating frames even when you don't see them because your input is still being processed even if you can't see it on your screen. So this might come from these questions might be a bit of a disconnect from people who are more into the competitive gaming scene versus the single player gaming scene, right? Because in a single player game where your priority is the visuals, you would frame rate limit before you go past your monitor's refresh rate, either through vsync or some other kind of frame rate limiter. Whereas in competitive games, you would not, okay? So hopefully this answered most of the questions from that video. Basically, yes, you can be CPU limited by a single thread, regardless of what the overall CPU utilization is, and that does not mean the game is necessarily badly programmed. It just means it's hard to parallelize everything to that extent. So if you're wanting to check, is your GPU limited by your CPU? If your GPU isn't reporting 100% well, usually it'd be more like 98, 99% utilization, then there's a good chance you're CPU limited, or you've run up against a frame rate limit from either having vsync on, or you've turned on a frame rate limiter, Or the game itself, some game engines won't go past a certain number. They just have a built-in limit. There can be other things. And by the way, when I say CPU limit, I'm also factoring in the RAM. So I'm thinking about the CPU and RAM together. Those do work kind of together in this calculation as I'm talking about it. Anyway, so that's that. And then with the frame generation, yes, you can force a frame rate limit, but you shouldn't. Okay? Hopefully this clears that stuff up. And I hope you all have an excellent day.